If he decides that he's going to run, would that preclude any sort of run that you would possibly make yourself?
I would not run if President Trump ran.
I don't put up with bullies. And when you kick back, it hurts them more if you're wearing heels. I'm Nikki Haley, and I'm running for president.
Times change, and so has Trump. He's gotten more unstable and unhinged.
Biden has been a catastrophe. So I will be voting for Trump.
So first she would not run against him. Then she did 3 months
Mika,
ago.
hold on. I'm so
list.
shocked. I'm so shocked. We want to hear your list.
Yeah,
Please.
it's a list. Like, I'm checking it off. So she wouldn't run against him. Then she did. 3 months ago, he was too unhinged to get a driver's license. And now Nikki Haley will vote for Donald Trump for president of the United States. Good morning,
Willie,
everybody.
this is one of those. I'm shocked. I mean, she's done this over and over again, right?
Yeah.
And I will say that let's just say right off the top, this happens in politics. I mean, people say nasty things about other people when they're running against for president, and then they come together. I do think, though, everybody has to make a choice, and in 2024, Nikki Haley could have made the choice that a lot of conservative Republicans have made. I'm going to be talking to Charlie Sykes about that in a little bit, and that is, you know what? Stay conservative and don't go along with the authoritarian. Don't go along with the guy that wants to amass more power in the White House and more power in Washington, D.C. than any president in American history. So her choice is support an authoritarian and a guy who's promised he's going to be an authoritarian. And I could go down the list, but he's promising it every day. Vote for me, Donald Trump says, and I will be a menace to American democracy. And, of course, Nikki Haley basically hinted at that and also called him a bully, said he was unstable, said he was unhinged, too unhinged to get a driver's license, as Mika said. And now it's like, oh, Biden, he's a disaster. I love when they start talking about how Biden's a disaster, and they really can't name anything. They go, oh, student loans, it's so horrible. And they compare student loans with people trying to overthrow American democracy, not understanding just how out of it and how stupid they feel. Then they'll call Joe Biden a socialist or a Marxist or a communist with the Dow over 40,000, with the economy stronger than it's ever been. And again, them not realizing just how stupid they sound. But, everybody's got to choose. And she has chosen. And unlike a lot of good conservatives, she's chosen the authoritarian leader. So let her go with that. And it's on her, not us.
Yeah, and by the way, she could make the choice that so many of her own supporters have been making in these primaries by not voting for Donald Trump. Not saying that I love Joe Biden, but saying I'm not willing to take the country down the road of Donald Trump again, which we're seeing in primary after primary. She's getting 15%, 20% on a campaign that she shut down a couple of months ago, a campaign that she ended by quoting Margaret Thatcher and saying, never just follow the crowd, suggesting I'm not going to just fall in line with Donald Trump. I'm never going to fall in line with Donald Trump. And now here she is in a move that, as you say, Joe, seemed inevitable to most people. Remember, she called him unhinged several times. He used a birther attack on her. He went after her husband, who's deployed in the United States military overseas, asking, where's the husband? Well, he was defending the country around the world. None of that seems to matter. You can go back to Ted Cruz and Marco Rubio. We've had this conversation 1,000 times. It just doesn't matter. But even take out the personal stuff. And as you guys point out, we're not talking about, is it Joe Biden or John McCain? Is it Joe Biden or Mitt Romney? Is it Joe Biden or George Bush? We're talking about a guy who has promised to undermine the foundations of this country and has already attempted to do so in our last election.
Yeah, I mean, she could have waited perhaps for a moment to come her way with all the different dynamics in this election. You never know, but she's chosen to go with Trump. Along with Joe, Willie, and me, we have the host of Way Too Early, White House Bureau Chief at Politico, Jonathan Lemire, the president of the National Action Network and host of MSNBC's Politics Nation, Reverend Al Sharpton, NBC News national affairs analyst John Heilman. He's a partner and chief political columnist at Puck. Former White House Director of Communications to President Obama, Jennifer Palmieri. She's co-host of the MSNBC podcast, How to Win 2024 with Claire McCaskill. And MSNBC contributor and author of the book, How the Right Lost Its Mind, Charlie Sykes. So here we are, and here is more of what Nikki Haley said yesterday in her first public appearance since exiting the race back in March, followed by what she was saying about Trump during the primary.
I put my priorities on a president who's going to have the backs of our allies and hold our enemies to account, who would secure the border, no more excuses, a president who would support capitalism and freedom, a president who understands we need less debt, not more debt. Trump has not been perfect on these policies. I've made that clear many, many times. But Biden has been a catastrophe. So I will be voting for Trump. Having said that, I stand by what I said in my suspension speech. Trump would be smart to reach out to the millions of people who voted for me and continue to support me, and not assume that they're just going to be with him. And I genuinely hope he does that.
You know, that is one of the most remarkably unmoored from facts description on why you're voting for Donald Trump I've ever heard in my life. I mean, it is mind-boggling that somebody who actually claims to know anything about policy would say what she just said. Like I said, I'm not shocked that she's cynical. She's been cynical her entire political career. It doesn't shock me she went back to Trump. But you're going to have to do a lot better than that, Nikki. I mean, hold our enemies to account? Hold our enemies to account? You know, John Heilman, where do we begin? When we talk about how he lavishes praise on Vladimir Putin. Trump lavishes praise on President Xi. Sends, quote, love letters to Kim Jong-un. He loves our enemies. He loves the tyrants that hate the United States of America to their very core. What is she talking about? Joe Biden has hemmed in China in the Pacific. We've seen it. We've talked about it. It's a part of the historical record. He's leading the effort to push back Vladimir Putin, where Donald Trump says basically, turn it over. I'm going to end this war in day one, and called Putin brilliant for what he did. And yes, he said he has a love affair with Kim Jong-un, the most ruthless tyrant who wants to nuke the West Coast of the United States of America. So hold our enemies to account. That is completely a fact-free garbage. And then you go to supporting capitalism. Let me say again, the Dow is over 40,000 points. If Rishi Sunak had the economy in Britain that we have here, he would be in much better shape on July the 4th when the next election is called. We have, and conservative economists will say this, and columnists will say, we have the strongest economy in the world. There's not a close second. We are the envy of the world. And so somehow Donald Trump is going to do better than that, throwing up tariffs and protective borders that even the Wall Street Journal calls, a nightmare. And then finally, the one that, again, because I got to Congress because I was worried about the national debt, She says, Joe Biden's been a disaster on the national debt. So she's going to support Donald Trump. Donald Trump, in 4 years, raised America's national debt more, just him, 45, than Presidents 1 through 44 did over 240 years. I mean, think about this. Think about just how wrong. We were supposed to play back-to-back clips. We were supposed to play those clips and then what you said in the campaign. I said, whoa, whoa, whoa. This is how people spread disinformation and lies and get away with it, where you just let shit keep going. Sometimes you need to stop things and just explain how big her lies were there. She lied about the economy. She lied about debt. Just look at the numbers. She lied through her teeth about debt, and she lied about Donald Trump holding our enemies accountable when he actually praises our enemies and sends love letters to them and talks about how brilliant they are because they can hold down millions and millions of their countrymen and women. I'll let you go from there. I'm seriously, I'm not shocked at the endorsement. I am shocked that she would sink so low so fast and just lie about the facts as badly as she did.
Morning, Joe. How are you? It seems like
I'm doing well. How are you doing?
The Rudy coffee is flowing.
No. I mean, if you're not shocked by that, John, I know it's very funny. Ha ha ha. But if you're not shocked by her lying through her teeth that way, like she could have picked 3 or 4 other issues. She could have talked about Afghanistan. She could have talked about inflation. She could have talked about 2 or 3, the cost of gasoline. But she picks these 3 things where she actually picks Donald Trump on policy, his weak.
This evening, the former president is set to hold a rally at the, Crotona Park in the Bronx. Yes. President Joe Biden defeated Trump in the Bronx by over 67 points in 2020. In 2016, Donald Trump lost the Bronx to Hillary Clinton by nearly 80 points. And ahead of that rally, the Biden-Harris 2024 campaign is out with a brand new ad highlighting the dire threat Donald Trump poses to Black America if he's reelected.
I'm Joe Biden, and I approve this message.
Of course I hate these people.
Donald Trump disrespecting black folk is nothing new. He was sued for refusing to rent his apartments to black families and called for the execution of 5 innocent black and brown teenagers.
And it's more than anger, it's hatred.
It's why Trump stood with violent white supremacists, warned of a bloodbath if he loses the next election, and if he's president again, vowed to be a dictator who wants revenge on his enemies. Now, who do you think that is?
Of course I hate these people.
Rev, your thoughts on that ad?
I think that ad is, first of all, is accurate. I was involved in fighting him on housing discrimination and marched on him about the Central Park Five. So they're not stretching the truth. That is his record. And you must remember that in all of the racial issues we've had in New York, from Howard Beach in the 80s, where a black kid was killed just for being in a white neighborhood, till now, the only race-sensitive case Donald Trump ever stood up on was to say that 5 black and brown young men should face the death penalty when a white woman was brutally and viciously beaten and raped in Central Park, and it ended up they didn't do it, and he still wouldn't take it back. He never stood up on any other issue. He was president when George Floyd happened, the biggest case in recent memory. He was president and did nothing other than say, if the looting starts, the shooting starts. So Congressman Torres, and you and I have worked on many of these issues together. For him to come to your district, first of all, he'll probably import some of the crowd because there's certainly not a lot of fervor for him there. But I think that he's using it as a prop, since he's kind of cornered into having to be in New York and can't do a lot because he's on criminal trial. How do you see the response in your district and in the Bronxes of the country because it could backfire and energize a lot of people to get angry that he's maneuvering sort of as a backdrop to him being having to be in New York for his criminal trial.
I think as far as we're concerned, Donald Trump is nothing more than a criminal suspect facing 91 felony counts, desperately searching for a self-pardon. So it's obvious to all of us that his priority is not the people of the Bronx. His priority is a self-pardon and self-preservation. And I'm confident that the people of the Bronx are not going to buy the snake oil he's selling. I mean, his presidency was a catastrophe for the Bronx. His mismanagement of COVID left a death toll of more than 7,000 in the Bronx, which is greater than the combined death count of Pearl Harbor and 9/11. So instead of holding a rally in Crotona Park, he should be apologizing to the people of the Bronx for the damage he's done.
Willie.
Congressman, good morning. You've written a new op-ed in the New York Daily News titled "The Bronx Gives a Bronx Cheer to Donald Trump." In it, the congressman writes, quote, "The Bronx is the bluest county in America. Is Trump so arrogant as to believe he is the one Republican who can compete in the bluest congressional district?" In answering that question, one must be reminded of who Trump is, a malignant narcissist with boundless delusions of grandeur. He once declared himself the best president ever for African Americans, even surpassing Abraham Lincoln. If only Lincoln had read The Art of the Deal, he tells himself, the Civil War would have been averted, just like October 7th or 9/11, or every human tragedy that has ever transpired would have been prevented by the omnipotence that Trump seems to attribute to himself. Any megalomaniac who ranks himself above Lincoln is too dangerously delusional to be anywhere near the Bronx, let alone the White House. That is the congressman's op-ed, part of it in the New York Daily News today. So, Congressman, there has been some concern if you look at polling, and we will use all the caveats that we're almost, 6 months away from Election Day. The Biden campaign believes that voters will come home, but we have seen in polling anyway at this early stage, some black voters, some Latino voters, in numbers larger than we've seen in the past for a Republican and numbers larger than we've seen for Donald Trump over a couple of previous elections, at least saying they are open to the idea of voting for Donald Trump. How much stock do you put into those numbers?
Look, obviously we have to be careful not to treat the Latino community as a monolith, right? There are elements of the Latino community that are open to voting for Republicans. George W. Bush won 40% of the vote in 2020. Having said all that, I'm confident that the Bronx is going to overwhelmingly reject Donald Trump. Based on the polling data that I've seen among likely voters in the Bronx, Donald Trump is so unpopular as to be radioactive. He's even less popular than arsenic in the Bronx. So I'm confident that the Bronx is going to overwhelmingly support Joe Biden.
I wonder where this crowd is going to come from.
Yeah, I want to just pick up where Willie is. When you look at the numbers for African Americans, the economy has never been better for them. Wages have never been better. Unemployment's never been better. Yet still, to Willie's point, there is a disconnect, particularly among black men. I can't figure that out. Try and explain it as best as you can.
Look, I sense men of all races. I see it among Latino men, African American men, white men. There is a bitter disillusionment with the system. There's a sense that the system is failing them, and that transcends any particular presidency. And obviously there's a challenge of inflation, which has been a global problem, but we have to tell the story of the Biden administration's success. We've had the fastest recovery from COVID of any major economy in the world. The president is addressing the cost of living. The Bronx has among the highest rates of diabetes. Capping the price of insulin at $35 a month is a game changer and a lifesaver for the people of the Bronx. President Biden created 15 million jobs compared to 2.9 million lost under Donald Trump. Donald Trump claims that he's in favor of cutting taxes. He imposed the largest tax increase in New York City in recent history. The loss of SALT deductibility cost our state $15 billion in revenue. So New Yorkers are paying more in taxes and receiving fewer services because of Donald Trump.
So, Congressman, you say you need to make the argument better. Democrats writ large need to make the argument
that was
better
pretty good.
As to what the administration needs to do. And you started to there. But are there a few points that seem like the Biden team is very proud of but haven't broken through yet? Like, for instance, the economy. You mentioned that. But also the fact it was Republicans who blocked this border bill. And it seems like immigration and migrants, a major issue here in New York City, also resonates nationally. The crime has actually gone down in most places this year. How can they be sharpening their message to have that actually break through? Because polls suggest it's not.
Look, I think we have to follow the Tom Suozzi model in New York 3, right? Instead of standing by passively and allowing the Republicans to weaponize the issue of border security, he leaned in. He proactively owned it. He defused the bomb, so to speak. And I feel like that should be the template that we follow on a national stage.
Brad.
Don't we, aren't we helped by looking at 2020 when the polls also said that Trump was having this bump up with black men, and it didn't happen. And I think, again, we're repeating the same mistake that, yes, some black men will go there as they did in 20, but he ended up getting just about what most Republicans got. And I think that we shouldn't get twisted with that. The other thing I want to ask you, Congressman, it has been suggested to me, we don't know the makeup of his jury in this hush money trial. And maybe there's some blacks and Latinos in the jury. Maybe this thing tonight is really about his lawyers saying we need to soften up some people in the jury that may look at you as racist or bigoted, because he could not be campaigning for votes. He could be campaigning to a jury.
Look, if Donald Trump did not have a criminal trial in New York City, he would never be caught dead in the Bronx. And as far as I'm concerned, the only place in the Bronx where Donald Trump has any place being is Bronx Criminal Court.
Okay.
So despite some strong economic numbers, new polling finds most Americans believe the country is in a recession. It is not. In the latest Harris poll conducted for The Guardian, 56% of adults expressed the belief that we are in a recession. That includes 67% of Republicans, 49% of Democrats, and 53% of independents. And although inflation has fallen sharply over the past year, 72% of adults still think that is increasing. Joining us now, former Treasury official, Morning Joe economic analyst Steve Rattner, to help us separate perception from the facts of this economy. Steve, good morning. So we can start with that idea of the United States being in a recession right now, which it plainly is not. We can talk about why so many Americans believe that, but let's talk first in your chart about where we really are.
Yeah, well, it's really quite an, an extraordinary poll. We've seen polls before that show Americans having a more negative view on the economy. I've never seen one quite like this. These are the numbers you mentioned in your lead-in, that roughly more than half of Americans think we're in a recession. It is divided somewhat by party. More Republicans, 67%, feel it than Democrats, but even Democrats, 49% feel it. We've seen this kind of divergence before. Interestingly enough, it flips around with every election, not surprisingly. But here's the reality. The reality is the economy has basically been growing since COVID, except for a very small downturn here. Under Joe Biden, it's grown by 2.8% a year, which is actually slightly faster than it was growing under Trump, even before COVID hit. And so you can see every quarter we've had reasonably strong economic growth. So why people feel this is really quite a mystery.
So, Steve, what about, this other sort of low unemployment, a surging stock market, and yet ... How do you explain what's going on with the economy?
Yeah, you get the same kind of news results when you look at those kinds of things. 50% of Americans think unemployment is at a 50-year high. 50% think it's at a 50-year high. Unemployment is actually at a 50-year low. It's really amazing. Unemployment is below 4%. It's been below 4% for months and months now, and it is it's just extraordinary that people think we're at a 50-year high. You can see some of the highs over here. Another issue is stocks. Half of Americans think stocks are down this year. Stocks are actually up 11% this year. They're up 45% since Joe Biden took office. Complete disconnect in people's minds between perception and reality of the stock market.
Well, it's how, there are some people who are legitimately feeling the pinch still. And yet, though, overall, Americans have a very negative perception of Biden's economy. And is that fair? What do you see?
What's interesting, and we've looked at some of these numbers before, is that if you ask people how their own finances are, about 75% think they're okay. And that really goes all the way back to 2018, pretty consistently. What's happened in the last number of years, and not just under Biden, but it really started back in about 2019 or thereabouts, the perception of how local economies are doing has deteriorated, and the perception of how the national economy is doing has deteriorated. So people have created this dichotomy in their minds between the national economy, their local economy, and themselves. What's also interesting, most recently, and these are from some other polls that have come out lately. What's also interesting is the way divergence between sentiment and approval has occurred. People's sentiment about the economy has actually been trending up. We had one bad number the other day, but we'll have to see if it's an aberration, if it jumps around a little bit. But the general trend has been improving sentiment. On the other hand, Biden's approval ratings have been trending down. Now, there are obviously a lot of other things going on, particularly the war in Gaza and so on and so forth. But there seems to be now a spread between how people feel about the economy to some degree and how they feel about Biden.
So let me bring Jen Palmieri into this, because what does the Biden campaign do with this? There is not just what Steve has laid out, but you have politicians, Nikki Haley, the Trump campaign, screaming from the rooftops pretty much anything about the Biden economy being, a complete failure and not a lot of truth to what they're saying. And then also some right-leaning networks echoing what you could argue is disinformation or at least loose facts. How does the Biden campaign pierce through this?
I mean, the first thing I would want to try to understand is how is to look at the data to understand why this is happening. I mean, it's interesting, Steve said, sort of where things diverged from what reality is and how people feel about it. It was around 19, 20. I mean, I think that people are still in just such trauma from COVID, from what happened to jobs, what happened to prices, supply chain during that time. They're still just feeling very uncertain. And so, and prices are still high. Inflation's not growing, but we don't have deflation. So I think what you want to do, I think you really want to let people know there is a strong foundation under us. So it's not so much Biden taking credit. I did this, I did that, I made everything better, but believe in the strong foundation of the economy so that you know that this is real and it's something we're going to build on, and then let people know what you're doing to make things more affordable to them. That's like the cost of insulin going down. Note when prices are decreasing, and that we're seeing that with some major chains have decided to do that to show people both the big picture, it's better, but then also the small differences in their own life of ways they're trying to make things more affordable, whether that's through student loans, health care, or even just noting when prices are dropping. And I feel like then maybe it can kind of take hold for people to be a little more real.
All right.
The Senate will hold a vote later today on the bipartisan border security package Republicans killed earlier this year. The move is expected to fail, with some Democrats and Republicans who supported it last time likely to vote against the measure this time around. Democrats are forcing the move to get Republicans on the record on border security ahead of November's elections. Republicans say Democrats are playing politics. Here is one of the lead negotiators for the bill, Republican Senator James Lankford of Oklahoma, who will be voting now against his own legislation.
The bill is no longer a bill, and now it's just a prop, and that's been my frustration. We wrote it to be a bill to try to actually solve the problem, and to say if this is not going to be the solution, then let's figure out what can be the solution, but let's just bring in prop votes.
Joining us now is Democratic member of the Foreign Relations Committee, Senator Chris Murphy of Connecticut. He, of course, is one of the lead negotiators of the border security and foreign aid legislation. Senator, good morning. It's great to see you. I'll let you address your colleague's criticism there, Senator Lankford. But just to remind our viewers, because so much has happened since, a brief history of this legislation, which Republicans said they wanted. They needed something on the border before they would go ahead and approve aid to Ukraine. You gave it to them, and then they turned their back on it. So where are we now with this?
Well, listen, I think it is important to remember that history. Republicans said, let's come together, Republicans and Democrats, and do something about border security. They appointed James Lankford, a hardline conservative senator on the border, to be their lead negotiator. I was in the room along with Kyrsten Sinema. Senator McConnell was in the room. Lindsey Graham was in the room for much of the negotiations. We produced a bill that was the toughest bipartisan border bill in a generation. It would have allowed the president to shut down the border when crossings get too high. It would have reformed the asylum system so that it never again takes 10 years for somebody to have their asylum claimed processed. It would have actually brought order to the southwest border. On the night that we released the bill, we had probably about 30 Republicans who were considering voting for it. And that night, that Sunday night, Donald Trump and his MAGA movement lit the bill on fire. They told all the Republicans in the Senate, we do not want the border fixed. We do not think we can win this election if the border is under control. We want the border a mess. And all but 4 Republicans in the Senate listened to them. But border security is still an issue. It hasn't gone away. The voters are telling us do something about it. And so we are bringing this bill back before the Senate today in the hopes that Republicans will join us. It's up to them as to whether they want to vote today to proceed to a debate. If they think the bill should be amended, as James Lankford says, then vote today to proceed to the bill, and then we can have an open amendment process to try to make it better. But my fear is they'll do the same thing again. They'll choose Donald Trump's request to keep the border a mess over border security, but we'll give them another chance today because the issue is so important to voters.
And it is incredibly rich, is it not, Senator, to hear your Republican colleagues now accusing you of playing politics by calling this vote when, in fact, you actually produced legislation that wasn't playing politics, that was trying to find a solution to a problem. And then they decided that they couldn't support it anymore because Donald Trump told them not to so that he could become president again.
Well, and as you mentioned, there will be Democrats that will vote against this bill today. Frankly, that's evidence of the fact that it is a true compromise. And that's what we spent 4 months crafting, an unprecedented border compromise that gives the president unprecedented new authorities to control the border. Mitch McConnell said it himself. He said publicly that Donald Trump told Republicans to vote for nothing. It wasn't that this bill wasn't good enough. Donald Trump told Republicans in the Senate, I want the border to remain a mess. I don't care about fixing the border. And, you know, it squares with reality. Republicans have never passed border security legislation when they've been in charge. Why? Because they can't imagine a world in which the border is fixed. They can't imagine a world in which they can't spend their weekends dressing up like Border Patrol officers, going down to the southwest border and complaining about the problem. But we don't get elected to just have press conferences and complain about problems. We get elected to solve problems, and this bipartisan border bill is our chance to do that. So I don't apologize for bringing this bill back up for another vote because it's a historic opportunity to solve the problem instead of doing what Republicans are addicted to, which is just complaining about the problem.
Senator, I want to turn you now to Israel. You at times have been sharply critical as to how Israel has conducted the war in Gaza and Prime Minister Netanyahu's refusal to endorse a two-state solution. We learned yesterday from Speaker Johnson that he's going to be inviting the Prime Minister to address Congress, and apparently Majority Leader Schumer has signed off on that. I want to ask your reaction here. Is this an appropriate moment for the Prime Minister to come to the United States and address the Congress?
Listen, I'm always open to foreign leaders, especially when it comes to allies of the United States coming to the United States to talk. I guess my question is whether this is in service of Netanyahu's political ambitions, his desire to stay in power, or whether this is in service of strengthening the U.S.-Israel relationship. If Netanyahu is coming to the United States to just chastise the Democratic Party and further embed himself with the Republican Party, I don't think that serves Israel's interests, nor strengthens the U.S.-Israel partnership. But if he's coming here to have an honest dialogue about how we bring peace to the region, how we wind down this war, and how we move towards a Palestinian state, then maybe that visit can be constructive. I've just seen nothing from Netanyahu in the last several months that indicates his goal is peace. What I've seen is that Netanyahu is guided by his desire to stay in power and avoid jail. That is not an interest of the United States, nor I think is it in service of the U.S.-Israel partnership.
So, Senator, I wanted to take a moment to talk about the 2-year anniversary of the Uvalde massacre. I know that you have some thoughts on this, especially representing Sandy Hook in Connecticut, and it being so long since that shooting really started a almost the epidemic was the beginning, the marker of gun violence and school shootings across America, among a few others. That amidst Donald Trump at his latest rally at the NRA promising to roll back all sorts of gun safety regulations that finally got through, and amid the lawsuits that families in Uvalde are dealing with, given the police response that was questionable at best. Your thoughts, sir, 2 years later?
So, anytime you hit one of these 1 or 2 or 3 year marks, those parents go through hell again. And not just the families in Uvalde. When there are stories about the Uvalde anniversary, it's the families in Sandy Hook who are reliving their nightmare. But it is important to remember that after Uvalde, we finally broke through. A month later, we passed the first gun safety bill in 30 years. And it's also really important to know that since we passed that bill in 2022, in honor of those kids who were killed in Uvalde and Sandy Hook, urban gun violence in this country has plummeted. Since that bill passed, urban gun violence rates in this country have gone down by over 20%. That means that there are literally thousands of people, mostly young men, who are alive today that wouldn't have been if we hadn't come together, Republicans and Democrats, after Uvalde and passed gun safety legislation with Joe Biden's help. And so as much as these anniversaries are moments to mourn, it is also a time to remember that it's possible, as we did after Uvalde, to come together and pass legislation that's popular and that's impactful. Laws that keep guns out of the hands of dangerous people and keep the most dangerous guns out of the hands of civilians, they do work. And the 2022 gun bill and the decrease in violence we've seen since then is proof of that.
Democratic Senator Chris Murphy of Connecticut, thank you very much for coming on this morning. Andrew, you sat down for an exclusive interview with French President Emmanuel Macron. We're going to play a little soundbite of that, a little bit of that interview in just a moment. But first, Andrew, what were your overall takeaways from the interview?
We talked about a lot of things, including geopolitics, jobs, actually the idea of wealth and trying to create billionaires here in Paris, frankly, and the criticism of wealth and inequality in this country. We got into a whole discussion about Gaza, and we also got into a discussion about China and the relationship between the U.S. and China, which is, I know, an issue that Joe and I have talked about before. But I think the issue that we're going to try to show a clip of right now has to do with how he's thinking about what would happen if a former President Trump becomes the president again, and how that might relate, for example, to the Paris Climate Accord.
Let's take a look at that right now.
I don't speculate on any elections, and especially in the U.S. election, so I don't want to make a sort of impossible scenario or in case of. But what's important is when the U.S. decided to withdraw for a while, at least we consolidate the rest of the club. And this is a period of time we used to have Turkey, Russia, and some others to stick to the agreement and sign and ratify. I think it would be a big mistake for U.S. It would be a big mistake for the planet, but big mistake for U.S. because the U.S., if the U.S. decides to leave Paris Agreement, it will be a perfect occasion offered to big carbonized economy not to do their fair share of the
You worked with him before, so what did you learn about working with him? Do you think that there would be a way to persuade him to remain in it?
Sometimes I succeed, sometimes I failed. So I'm very humble. I have no answer to that. I do my best, and I will do my best to convince him if he were president, and I do my best to convince when I think this is a good idea as well, President Biden, and we work very closely and very well with this administration. But I think the U.S. as the first economy of this world, has a very important role to play to decarbonize its economy.
I'm curious, Andrew. That's, of course, the president on Donald Trump. What about on the United States in general? I've noted a sense of defiance against the United States. Just believing that the U.S. is stepping on allies, obviously still upset about the Australian nuclear sub deal. What deeper sense did you get about his concerns about America's strength economically?
It is so clear that one of the things that he is pursuing is sovereignty. He wants the European Union to be independent, I think, because he's worried, frankly, about how much support he's going to be able to get from the U.S. And you see that manifesting itself in the war against Russia with Ukraine. And I think that he's deeply concerned about what that relationship with the U.S. looks like. He's also, by the way, we're talking about China. He's deeply concerned about the way we, the U.S., speaks about China as an enemy in some cases, and the idea that ultimately we're going to all have to have some kind of relationship to get things done, including around climate change and the like. But I think there is this idea that seems to pervade all that he talks about of trying to be sovereign, of trying to be independent, because he's not sure whether the support is going to come from allies in the future the way maybe it had in the past.
Okay. Andrew Ross Sorkin in Paris. And I know you got the interview with Macron, but you know that Taylor already left. So you missed that, Andrew.
I know she left. But we're 54 days ahead of the Olympics, I should say.
Okay.
And you can, by the way, this whole city is just teeming with people. It is really, I must say, they're all preparing. You can see the preparations ongoing. And I should also, by the way, mention one of the things that President Macron is trying to do, which I think would be very interesting if he gets there, but I think it's going to be very hard. He's trying to call for what's called an Olympic truce between Ukraine and Russia during the Olympics. This goes back. There's the idea of an Olympic truce goes back to the ancient Greek days. Putin is not going along with it, but he actually got President Xi of China to publicly declare that he would like a truce during the Olympics. Of course, it would only be temporary. So we'll be watching that story play out geopolitically as we get closer to the Olympics.
All right, Andrew, thank you very much. And you can see Andrew Ross Sorkin's extended interview with President Emmanuel Macron tonight at 8 o'clock Eastern on CNBC. And Amy, will start with the Cook Political Report, out with a new look at the 2024 race and the issues that matter most to likely swing state voters. In a new survey that is out today, Donald Trump has a lead within the margin of error in Arizona, Georgia, Michigan, Nevada, North Carolina, and Pennsylvania. And he and President Joe Biden are tied in Wisconsin. Swing state voters say the economy is the issue that matters most to them, with their own cost of living being the best way to measure it. They also say they are more worried about Biden setting economic policy than about Trump setting abortion policy. And Biden's age is also seen as more of a concern than Trump's temperament and legal issues. Amy, break this down for us, if you could.
Yeah, sure. Thanks for having me. And we looked at voters in all of those important battleground states because we know that those are the states that are ultimately going to decide the next president. And, you know, sometimes politics is complicated and sometimes it's not. In this case, it's not all that complicated. Voters really are frustrated and really disillusioned about the cost of things. It is driving how they think about politics right now. It's the lens through which they are viewing this election. And that helps Donald Trump a lot, not just because they think that Donald Trump would be better on the economy, but they really do believe that the president himself has more power over controlling inflation and prices than a president actually does have. Almost 60% of voters in this poll think that President Biden himself does have control over how much stuff costs. And they don't think that he's doing a particularly good job of it. When we asked how they think Donald Trump would handle issues like controlling the cost of living, 56% said they think he'd do a good job. Only 40% said that of Biden. That's where this race sits right now. And it's one thing, you know, look, we've seen in the past, Mika, that candidates who are seen as maybe not as strong on the economy ultimately win an election, like, say, Barack Obama in 2012. But to be losing by this margin, that is unsustainable at this point for an incumbent.
Yeah, Molly, certainly these numbers are eyebrow-raising. I mean, the overall, it's pretty close. Nevada's 9 points, but most of them are in North Carolina 7, but most within a couple. But the economy, if that's what this election is about, it looks like, per this poll, that President Biden would be in trouble, even though his team would argue vociferously, look at the job we've done since COVID. Look how we've repaired things. So how much of this is Trump amnesia, where people have deluded themselves so the economy was better than actually it was when Trump was in office? And how much of this is simply inflation, which just angers people? And honestly, there's not much a president can do about it.
Well, people hate inflation, and the idea that something you bought is now, significantly higher is just
it's infuriating.
Voters hate that.
Yeah.
But I'm curious, just with the methodology, if I can throw it to Amy here, what is the methodology on this poll, and how was it conducted, and also just can you tell us a little more about the crosstabs?
Yeah, sure. This was conducted by 2 polling firms, GS Strategies and BSG, one Republican firm, another a Democratic firm. This was online panels and web to text. So this is the way that you can try to get as many voters in your sample that you get through the web and through texts. I think if you look through the crosstabs, the thing that you start to notice is how many undecideds are sitting there that are potentially still able to be won over by Biden. And the question is, what are the issues that are going to motivate them? As you guys pointed out, Trump is ahead in every single one of these states. The one that stands out to me the most is Nevada, where he's close to 50% there. But in these other states, he's basically hitting his 2020 levels. And so to me, it's not as much as that Trump is surging, it's that Biden is really sagging. And the question is, can he get those voters back? If so, I don't know if he gets them back simply on talking about Trump as an existential threat. I think he has to talk about the ways in which Donald Trump's answer to the economy is not going to solve their problems. So you can't ignore that.
Another takeaway from the polling of these swing state voters, which is where the election's going to be won or lost. Lauren Leader, is these voters saying they're more worried about Biden setting economic policy than about Trump setting abortion policy. And if anyone thinks that it can't get worse, it can. I mean, the birth control, Plan B, all these things are on the line.
Yeah, and I bet like Molly, I definitely would love to see how this breaks down on gender lines, because as we know, women are more likely to turn out in elections. So sometimes this is one place where, especially the smaller polls in swing states get a little off base, is that it discounts then what the actual turnout factor is. But it's not to discount this. Look, I think on the undecided voters, we've been hearing this for a while. There've been a bunch of focus groups. My colleague Mark Halpern's been doing a lot of these, looking at what's happening with these undecideds. When you look at Arizona, I think there's going to be some interesting dynamics relative to the ballot initiative there, which I think has the potential to change the turnout factors, right? So we know that Democrats benefit from turnout. But look, there's no question, Biden cannot seem to get any wind under his sails on the economy. No one believes him. And we heard Steve Ratner earlier, just the basic wrong information that people have about the state of the economy. It's really remarkable. I think Biden came to this a little late. He's trying to campaign on it now, but they haven't really talked about this for the last few years. Americans continue to think that Republicans, no matter who they are better on the economy, which is just factually wrong. But I don't know how you keep arguing that.
Joe.
It's a great question. When 50% of Americans think unemployment is at record highs and unemployment's at 50-year lows, when they think we're in a recession and our economy is actually the strongest in the world, you can throw your hands up or you can figure out how to get the message across, and that's what they've got to do. Amy, I am curious, though. I'd love to get your insight on the issue of abortion in this sense. Before the 22 election, abortion was polling at 4, 5, 6% in a lot of national polls. And I would listen to podcasts, would mock and ridicule Joe Biden for talking about abortion and democracy. And everybody laughed, oh my God, the old man, he doesn't understand. And I was on the phone, actually, Lauren Leader just said his name, I was on the phone with Mark Halpern early election evening of 22, and he called me. He goes, okay, help me. Wait, what's going on with this abortion number? It's at 33%, like in some of these exit polls, is the most important issue. And we were trying to figure out, wait, were they just polling Democrats? What was it? It ended up being the defining issue of that race. It ended up being the defining issue of the Wisconsin Supreme Court case. We could go through all of it. I'm trying to figure out the disconnect, like 6 months out, 3 months out, 1 month out, where people go, abortion doesn't matter. And then when they go to the polls, man, it seems to be the top issue. Can you help sort through that for us?
I will, and I think these are great questions that you all are raising about this, which is why this is a nice starting point for us. It's not the ending point. And I think, one reaction to what happened in 2022 is that the people who were the most motivated to actually go out and vote are the kinds of people that traditionally now are voting for Democrats. In fact, I think Lauren asked a question about how women are breaking down on this question about abortion versus the economy. The one group of voters that said that Donald Trump's position on the abortion was more important to them than, or was more worrisome to them than Biden on the economy, were college-educated women. Yeah. And so that group of voters, clearly influential in 2022. I think for the Team Biden, what they need is for other voters besides that group, voters who didn't show up in 2022 but plan on showing up in 2024. How are they viewing that issue? That's the group that we're going to be watching very, very closely, especially the closer we get to this election. And the other thing that was, to me, eye-opening about this poll is that it's not that voters don't think that Donald Trump will be more restrictive on the issue. Majorities thought that if Donald Trump is president, there would be the potential for a national ban on abortion. So the stakes are in front of them. That's the question, is do they start to come in?
Mm-hmm. Amy, tell me about this. We've heard time and again that it's black men, Hispanic men, it's young voters that are sort of wandering away from Biden in worrisome numbers. Are you of the, based on the polling that you see, based on these swing state polls, are you of the opinion that if Biden takes care of the base, brings these base voters back home with him, that he will likely win this election?
I think he needs to bring those folks back to get sort of back to even. And then he needs to do better with independent voters, especially independent women voters. And we're going to be digging into those numbers in the coming weeks, because those are the folks right now who seem to be the most sort of either undecided or curious about Donald Trump, that they need a further examination.
Rev, we've talked about Joe Biden getting tepid support in the black community. I'm curious your thoughts, looking at these swing state polls, but also looking at how they seem to be focusing the Biden campaign more on black voters, Hispanic voters, younger voters with the Morehouse College speech. I'm curious, what do they need to do over the next 2, 3, 4 months to firm up that support before we have the final dash in the fall?
I think they're beginning to do it. It's late, but they're beginning to do it. And that is, they must start focusing some of their messaging right to black voters, young black men. You and I both know music well. There's a difference in a pop station and an R&B station and a hip-hop station. And the problem is they've been playing broad politics when they should also deal with various identifiable issues for different constituencies. Talk to black men about how high unemployment was for black men when Trump was in, as compared to now, where it's a record low among black unemployment in the last 50 years. Talk about criminal justice. Donald Trump's position on the Central Park 5, which was totally wrong. And Joe Biden has never done. In fact, Joe Biden signed the George Floyd Justice and Policing act as an executive order when everybody with Donald Trump voted against it as legislation. They must show the contrast directly in the Latino community and the black community. Don't expect me to understand a pop hit if you're not playing it on my station. I want to hear James Brown. I want to hear somebody I know. I don't know some of the other acts, and I think that they're beginning to do that when I saw this latest commercial they dropped geared toward the black vote.
Really good. Publisher and editor-in-chief of the Cook Political Report, Amy Walter, thank you very much for coming on this morning.